I'm Sharon Anderson, and I want to introduce you to my co-pilot, Dorothy Skelley. She's my editor. Bless her heart, I can't do it without her. So, welcome, welcome. I know I have to stay on camera, sorry. How many of you here are washershores? Good, okay. I'm a car ashore. I came by car, not boat. But anyhow, raise your hands again. Almost the whole group, that's awesome. How many of you are true Cape Codders? You were born here and look at that. Awesome, awesome, awesome. Okay, next question. How many of you are writers? Scratch that. How many of you are readers? Oh, how wonderful. Because if we didn't have you as readers, what good would it be to write? So thank you for being our readers. Next, oh, hang on. It's Dorothy. Okay. How many of you here are pilots? No? Okay. How many of you here have read the book? At least I know. Camera, sorry. At least I know you're all a captive audience because it's cold outside, so you'd want to stay in here and be warm. We're here, Dorothy and I, and I'm not here to sell books. We're not here to sell books. Believe me, that's not our purpose. You don't see any over there, or not too many. That's because they're on order. But we're here to tell you a little bit about history about our airport and the importance of the airport. So I think my cheat sheet's done. We're ready to go. What? I'm not on camera. You want to just go on. You know, I'm used to speaking to people.
You are. You are. You're talking to people.
I meant facing them. But okay, I'll hide. Didn't advance.
There we go.
Yeah.
And then you just use this button here.
Okay.
To push, to move them forward.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. The inspiration for the book. Why did I write it? I don't know. But I don't know about you, but I used to cheat. In fact, I still do. If I'm coming up 28, I go in, sneak in through the airport road because it gets me closer because I live off of Finney Lane. Now that's a swear word because they're digging it up. Yeah, I see some heads bobbing. Thank you. Okay, so doing that, squeezing through that airport, I thought, how did this airport happen? So I called, actually I sent a text to Katie, who is the manager of the Cape Cod, the airport. And I asked her how she felt about me writing a book about the airport. And she thought it was a good idea. So we collaborated. And the airport, I don't think people realize how important the airport is. The airport is a global link. It linked us globally. When boy, am I nervous. I just want you to know that. Okay. Until we had the airport, we were a pretty rural community, the whole Cape. There were not many people here. I think 30,000 people total. Not many. There were that many on Route 132 every day. So having an airport here really linked us globally. And also, the role the airport played in building the tourism? Absolutely. Absolutely. And the role the airport played during World War I, we'll get into that further into the presentation. And anyhow, when the book went to my beta readers, they all said that it was a story that needed to be told. So next slide. I did it. The different names of the airport. The 1920s, it was Hyannis Airport. 1930s, it was Hyannis Municipal Airport. 1940s to 1950s, Barnstable Municipal Airport. 1981, the 50th anniversary of the Boardman, Polando. That's famous. It's in the book. We'll hit it later. It changed to Boardman, Polando Airport, and now it's Cape Cod Gateway Airport. Pioneers and visionaries. I went there. What? No. I went too far. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Okay, Charles Lincoln Ayling was a visionary. He was a very successful banker and a philanthropist. And over the course of 50 years, he helped shape Cape Cod. His legacy includes the hospital, that's the Cape Cod Hospital, Centerville Library, Centerville Historical Society, and the airport. He made the first around the Cape trip in a Stanley steamer car. Do you want to know? Can you guess? Anybody guess how long that took him? What's the answer, Dorothy? Anybody guess? 2 days? What do you got?
7 days, 6 days, 7 days. 8. It took 36 hours. Yes, and he, went down with now 6A and 28, and they were, they weren't paved roads. They were just really dirt roads.
Yeah.
And he had to contend with, wagons coming in both directions. So it was a pretty arduous trip.
Now, this morning, I looked up Stanley Steamer. Actually, Stanley Steamer, now, if anyone has one, they go for about $120,000, I think, maybe more. No, I know it's more. I know it's in the millions. But at that time, a Ford car was like $500 and a Stanley steamer was like $3,000. Next slide. I did it. Okay, Charles Ayling formed the Hyannis Airport Corporation. And attorney George E. Adams from Quincy was also on the board. Does that name ring a bell for anybody? Amelia Earhart was a stockholder and a member of the board. And Robertson Bob Ayling, who is Charles Ayling's son, was 20 years old with a new pilot's license from Denison Airport, which is Squantum as we know it. Now, Daddy has a young man who has a pilot's license that has no place to put his plane. guess what? Daddy, we need an airport. Unfortunately, Robert did serve as manager of the airport, but he died in 1930 in a boating accident. He was 22 years old. Okay. Early pilots, Cape Cod Aero Club. These are aren't they a motley group? I think the second one in from it would be from my left. I think it might be yours too. I think that's Brewster, the writer of the book. We'll get to that, the log. But these are all pilots, and they're trained. They want to learn how to fly. So because it was expensive to rent a plane to practice on, they purchased their own plane and they swapped off to use it. And they finally, it took them a couple of years, but they finally let the club become co-ed. Here is my buddy, Alton Brewster Sherman. He was an adventurer, pioneer, entrepreneur, but he was, Dorothy called him a chief cook and bottle washer. He managed the airport for 25 years, from 1931 to 1956. It was a non-salaried position. He rented the airport for $50 a year from the town of Barnstable. He was a certified pilot to train other pilots. He ran a charter service, and he was also, he liked to fly really fast, so he won the Glenn Curtis Trophy in Miami, which was a national air race. He won it three years in a row, 33, 34, and 35. And why Dorothy calls him a chief cook and bottle washer. Many times he would have people, he would fly people on a charter flight, bring them here to the Cape, and then he would take them because he would take them from the airport and he would drive them home or wherever they were going. This is the pilot's log, and believe me, it's in the book. Pilot's log, it's a very precious thing to a pilot because it's like their resume. Every pilot that landed at the airport had to sign the log. It was absolutely official. So the log states the date, the name of the person, the pilot, the home airport where he came from, the time he arrived, the duration of the flight, how long it took him to get here. Was that? Well, anyhow, then the kind of a plane they call it a ship, and the type of a plane, which is the name of it, and the remarks column. I had more fun reading that because sometimes as you went down the column, they would say, business, blah, blah, blah. One of the remarks was a $sign, so we knew what that was. But then another one was bringing Gloria Swanson here to the Cape. So. Now, Dorothy, you going to do this one?
Sure.
So just to give you some perspective of what it was like in the 20s here on the Cape, I'm going to kind of take you back. And as Sharon said, it was pretty rural here. It was pretty hard to get here. In the early 1800s, you'd have to come by packet boat, which would take about 7 hours to come from Boston to Chatham, or the stagecoach, which was a pretty long, I think it took about 3 days. And all along the route, there would be inns and taverns so that people had someplace to stay and someplace to eat. So I suspect if anybody was coming to the Cape, it was either for business or perhaps they were visiting relatives. But yeah, it wasn't easy to get here. In the mid to late 1800s, the railroad expansion really attracted tourists. So by 1943, the railroad had come to Sandwich, and then bit by bit, tracks were laid all the way down to Provincetown. So you've started to see in the late 1800s, some resorts start to crop up, like the Belmont in Harwich, the Chatham Hotel, which had kind of a rough start and didn't do as well. And then, of course, in 1914, you had the Chatham Bars Inn. So all of a sudden, people said, well, gee, Cape would be kind of a nice place to vacation if you had the dollars to do that. So in 1910, the drawbridges were built. 1910, the Buzzards Bay Railroad Bridge, and then 1912, the Bourne Bridge, and the year after, the Sagamore Bridge. And in 1914, the canal opened as a toll waterway that connected Cape Cod to Buzzards Bay. I don't know how familiar you are with the history of the canal, but unfortunately, that canal wasn't very deep in 1914. So a lot of ships would get stuck, which later on I think had to be rebuilt. But at least you could finally get around, get through that area without having to go completely around the Cape. And then in 1928, the airport opened. I'm sorry. But probably the biggest boom was in the 1920s when the Model T started to be mass produced, and it was much more affordable, and that really increased access to the Cape. 1928, the Hyannis Airport opened, and then, of course, in 35, the canal and the railroad and Bourne and Sagamore bridges were rebuilt, and that could accommodate even more tourists. By 1935, 650 planes had visited the airport. And again, by 1935, half of the U.S. households owned a car, which kind of surprised me. The average cost of a Ford was $655. And you had to put 35% down. And then you'd have like a balance of $426. You had 12 months to pay it off. So it was $35 a month, which is still, given that I think the average salary was about $1,600 then. But it was, a year. Yeah. And actually Ford's had started with a kind of a layaway plan. And people could, pay like $10 a month, but people were impatient and they wanted that car. And it was actually GMAC who started the first car loan program. And then Ford said, well, I guess we're going to have to do that too. But now the population is on the move. So Cape Cod, here we come, and they did. So again, now we're starting to think of Cape Cod as a destination. And year-round population was less than 30,000 across the Cape. Modest motels and cottages became available, and tourism really started infusing the economy. Airport opened in 28. Air travel attracted the rich and famous. So, so also during this period, the artist colony started forming. The largest enclave being in Provincetown. Before air conditioning, the New York theaters would close down in the summer because it was too hot. So all of a sudden, theater companies started coming from Falmouth to Provincetown, and they attracted the biggest stars of the day. So we're going to do a little pop quiz to see if you can reach back and not that you will remember these people personally, but some of these early stars, see if you can name any of them. You know who that is? That's Gertrude Lawrence, and she actually had a house in Dennis. These are really early stars. Basil Rathbone, right? Yeah, yeah. And this is our frequent flyer, Gloria Swanson. We don't know why she was a frequent flyer here, but yeah. Yeah. And of course. So the Cape Playhouse opened in 1927, and it's America's oldest professional summer theater. And as a matter of fact, Betty Davis started off as an usher there. In 1930, they built the Cape Cinema, which is still standing today. And in 1939, it was the first cinema to preview The Wizard of Oz before its Hollywood premiere. So the other big business here during Prohibition was bootlegging. And the bays and inlets and rivers on the Cape served as ports for Prohibition cargo. And Canadian ships brought the liquor to the 12-mile limit. And the Coast Guard was monitoring all this. But airplanes also would warn residents of the ship's arrival. So in other words, you had all these folks waiting for the drop, and the airplanes would signal them, and they would come out and scoop it all up. And it's also rumored that some of the airports were transporting liquor as well. So, and we had speakeasies here on Cape Cod. In fact, Great Neck Road north in Mashpee was dubbed the Prohibition Highway. The Casa Madrid, does anybody know this building? Well, this building still stands on Run Pond Road in Yarmouth. I don't know what it's used for at this point, but that was open during Prohibition. And then, just like restaurants and inns would sort of quietly, I don't know if you'd call them speakeasies, but they would quietly be serving liquor, like the Mayflower Cafe in Hyannis. And it was actually a very popular spot for pilots and their visitors. And the third drink was free. That's a good deal. So, and keep in mind that all of this is happening in the midst of the Great Depression. So it's a very exciting time. And Sharon's going to talk about what it was like in the beginning of the airport.
Well, during the time when the airport, when they first opened it up, they had little two-seaters like the plane you see in front of you. It's kind of a big difference, a big contrast, because now I was at the airport one day when a JetBlue came around. I was going through the airport, and I saw the JetBlue comes taxiing down. And he was close enough. I mean, if I stepped out of my car, I could have touched him. What other airport in the world do you think that we could do that? And don't tell me Marston's Mills, because I know that. To begin with, they acquired a 57-acre tip-top farm from George Wagner. On April 5th, 1928, Robert Ayling, this is the son, painted a picture of the airport's prospects to the Hyannis Board of Trade. Now, the people that were on the Board of Trade, I'm sorry to say, or I'm happy to say, had never been near an airplane. Their only acquaintance would have been pictures in a newspaper. So he was out there hustling, what they call it, a side hustle. The civil engineer that laid out the airport was George Clements of Yarmouthport. And then Robertson, bless his little heart, purchased a tractor to clear the land and dynamite to remove the stumps. Now, these were grass fields, so they had to be mowed. Amazing. and 30 tons of grass seed every year to replant it. The first landing was June 17th, 1928. The Waco 9, look at her. She's really substantial, but people flew in her. He took off from Denison Airport, landed on we had one grassy runway in Hyannis, and it was piloted by Alton, Sherman, Brewster. No, the other way around, Alton, Brewster, Sherman. We have to fix that one, Dorothy. I'm going to get his name backwards. And he had a passenger with him, Edward Ormsby of Boston. So, oh, Dorothy, would you come and do this one? Because this is your favorite.
So lest we think that the airport was just for the rich and famous to fly in and out of, it also was used beginning in 1928 as the Hyannis Airport football field for Barnstable High School. Also in 1928, airmail service started. And this is a commemorative stamp. And it says around it, it says, we face 4 seas. Does anybody know where that comes from, that phrase? We face 4 seas. Which 4 seas do you think it refers to? Well, it's actually based on a poem from Mabel Finney. You got the answer partly right. So, and it was called Cape Cod Calls. And the 4 seas that she refers to are the Atlantic Ocean, Buzzards Bay, Nantucket Sound, and Cape Cod Bay. Thank you, yes. And yes, and you are right. The 4 Seas ice cream place, which opened in 1934 and is actually the oldest continuously operating ice cream place in Massachusetts. And I think it's like 3rd in New England. But yes, the owners of that named the ice cream store after that home. And then the next year, 1929, all of a sudden the Boston Herald Traveler was delivered. So you could, so as I said, it's even though it seems like it would just be the rich and famous flying in and out, these kinds of things made lots of things more accessible to everybody on Cape Cod.
Remember, I said we'd get back to the Boardman, Polando. Okay, this is why the airport was named after these 2 young men. July 28th to the 30th, 1931 established a new transatlantic distance record, 5,011.8 miles. They covered it in 49 hours and 20 minutes from New York to Istanbul. They trained at the Hyannis Airport, and the reason we are so happy about it is because they named the plane Cape Cod. You can see it a little bit behind them. And this was to mark the 50th anniversary, and I think I mentioned that earlier. This historic flight, the airport was renamed Boardman, Polando. Okay, radio communications. Do you want to do no, I do this one. Thank you. My turn. Prior to 1933, you could only fly during the day because there was no other way. But the airport got one of our airport, and Sherman pushed for this. He got one of the 4 radio beams of the Boston radio range, so that the aircraft could receive sets within 100 miles. And, aircrafts with receiving sets within 100 miles and tuned to the Boston radio range, they could receive weather conditions every half hour. So it made flying a lot easier. It provided a sound mark course for aircraft 24 hours a day. And it eliminated what am I doing wrong? I don't know. Eliminated the guesswork regarding the weather. Is that me? Somebody's phone?
It's fine.
We won't say anything. All right.
Go back.
This,
Yeah, well, we can go from here,
oh, wait a minute, sorry.
right there. No,
Yes. That's right.
no, doesn't it come after? No,
Mhm.
okay. The argument. He won. Okay, this, we put this section of slides in because we did a presentation at the Hyannis Yacht Club. And we didn't want them to feel left out because there were such a thing as seaplanes. And the seaplane, and this is all in the log, by the way. The seaplane meet was held in Oyster Harbors on August 31st in 1933, and it was hosted by Felix DuPont and William Danforth. The seaplanes flew in from Delaware, Boston, and New York, and there were races, exhibits, and flying events. Guess who was a judge? Amelia Earhart. It seems she was, the log doesn't show too many references to her, but she was pretty active here at the airport. By the late 1930s, seaplanes were the largest and fastest planes in the world. And one of the things I like about a seaplane, and think about it for a minute, it's a lot softer to land on water than it is to land on a solid field. No? You didn't like that joke? Never mind. Oh, any of you remember James Michael Curley? Raise hands if you did. Aha, okay. James Michael Curley. Infamous mayor of Boston and governor of Massachusetts. He came to the Cape for an air inspection of the new National Guard station. He flew his seaplane into Oyster Harbors. Now, he had his pilot's license, but he failed to make a perfect landing. He was so in a hurry to get out of the plane, he fell overboard and dropped right into the water. And he came right out, didn't bother him. Okay, becoming a municipal airport. Now, this was very important in the growth of the airport. And Sherman, again, really pushed for this because once it became, well, in other words, the town had to buy the airport, basically. And so they finally purchased it in 1936, and that made it a municipal airport rather than just a little landing field. Now it's eligible for government funding. Pretty cagey on Sherman's part. But don't forget, and I'm going to talk about Homeland Security here. The airport is and was important for Homeland Security. I'll back up a little bit. I do a podcast, and it's called Ghostly Residents of Old Cape Cod. And I just did the Nimrod. Now, the Nimrod, I don't know if you know it or not, but yeah, I see some faces. It's a restaurant in Falmouth. But its claim to fame was a cannonball that was lodged in one of the walls. Okay, now, why did that cannonball get lodged there? Okay. Homeland Security on the shore of Falmouth Heights or wherever, there were several cannons. Now, where did they get them? That's my question. But the thing is, that was our defense. That was our homeland security, because the HMS Nimrod stopped, they were in the bay and they were firing on Falmouth. They fired 300 cannonballs. I know, but did you see? Homeland Security was the little cannons that they had lined up, and HMS Nimrod didn't want them there. Okay, that's my story. Never mind. Let's see. The airport basically was closed in the winter. But in 1920, now here are some statistics. In 1929, we flew 1,200 passengers for the year. By 1947, that number grew to 10,000 passengers. The role of the airport during World War II. Now, this is kind of important too. These are Navy Hellcats, and the photo came from Wikipedia. But the Navy now assumed control of the airport. Remember, we are strategic. They took over the airport to train pilots. Both the Navy and the Army Air Forces flew anti-submarine patrols from the airport. And how many of you remember that there was a German sub off of Orleans? Anybody ever heard that story? Yeah, I see somebody nodding, yeah. So when the Navy came in, they built Quonset huts to house 200 sailors, mechanics, and line personnel. And they added hangars and field buildings, but they also replaced the grass fields with tarmac for 4,000-foot runways. So we still have 4 of them, but we only use 2. The airport became known as, here's a mouthful, the Naval Auxiliary Air Facility Hyannis. We were auxiliary to the Naval Air Station at Quonset, mostly used for training bomber pilots, including former President George H. Bush. Fully operational from 1942 to 1945. And we operated Douglas B-18 Bolo aircraft on anti-submarine patrols. That's why I asked if there were any pilots that would know the size of those planes. Naval Ferry Command. Now, this is Lieutenant Alton B. Sherman. By the way, he's the young man that wrote the log. He was called up to head the Naval Ferry Base in Hutchinson, Kansas, so he had to leave the airport. He still managed it, though, remotely. He was brought there to train Navy pilots in ferry procedure and flying. And the planes that that were there were delivered to naval air stations within the United States. But Sherman still managed the airport. My quote from Jane, by the way, Colonel Doolittle is in the log quite a few times. His quote, and I thought this was so apropos, the first lesson is that you can't lose a war if you have command of the air. And you can't win a war if you haven't. Post-World War II. Dorothy, did you want to do this one? Because I think yours is coming up.
So I'm sure everybody is familiar with this photograph. And it took a long time to really identify to find out the true identities. And a lot of people came forward and said, oh, that was me. But it wasn't. And And in fact, everybody thinks that this is a nurse, but she was a dental assistant who happened to be, she happened to be working in one of the buildings. And of course, everybody was going crazy. So, so this was a big deal at the time. This is a tidal blimp. And it didn't land at the airport. It just stayed aloft. And its animated wings were 116 feet. And the whole thing was over 256 feet long. It was filled with 500,000 cubic feet of helium gas. And this is the one that kills me. It was illuminated by over 10,000 lights. So you could, light bulbs, yeah. So you could see it from 5 miles away. So it was it's a big deal here. And it was the largest electrically lighted blimp built. And it had been formerly in naval service. So what we found after about 1947 is that the law kind of gets more and more sparse. I think it was kind of like, business as usual now. We were, wasn't a fledgling airport. We were, this major hub. And actually, I'm sorry, we misquoted before. There was 10,000 in 1946, 2,000 passengers. And by 47, they anticipated 35,000. So it's a big leap. 1,000 planes, private and commercial, landed here. And they started adding some major air carriers like Northeast Airlines and New England Airlines, New England Central, and Cape Air Service, which is still in service today. I don't know, it's the same. Owned by the same people. But so I think that Alton Sherman was pretty busy running the airport, and things didn't seem quite as exciting, I guess, as being a fledgling airport. So that, as I said, the law gets a little sparse, except for this entry. So in 1947, Santa landed at the airport to the delight of the Cape Cod children. But I happened to come across this, but prior to that exciting arrival on Cape Cod, there was a Maine float plane pilot named William Winkapaw. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And he was a pioneer in the early days of aviation as well. And he was so appreciative of all of the lighthouses that would help him on his journey. That and they were very remote. I mean, families lived in these lighthouses, and they were really remote locations. And so to thank them for being, keeping such a watchful eye, especially during bad weather, on December 25th, 1929, he loaded his plane with dozens of packages, with candy, with coffee, small toys, magazines, things like that. And he dropped these modest gifts to the lighthouse families in the Rockland area of Maine. And over time, other pilots joined in, and it would take 2 days to cover the 115 lighthouses and Coast Guard stations from Cohasset to the Canadian border. And that tradition has carried on for 93 years. It's called the Friends of Flying Santa. So now we would really like to open this up to the group to share their memories and stories. I think Sharon has one.
I wanted to end.
Yeah, why don't
You
want? Okay, all right. So does anybody have any memories, or in oral tradition, a lot of stories are passed down. We had someone tell us about their father who lived near the Marston's Mills airfield, and how he was only like 10 years old, and he would race over to the airfield and catch a flight to see the sunset. In the same way a kid would ride his bicycle to the beach, he'd just hop on a plane. So does anybody else have any memories? Or yes. Any other memories, stories?
Speaking of Falmouth, we ran into something because the Pilots Association has asked us we'll be doing a presentation for them too. But in Falmouth, what is that called? There is
the air park.
Yeah, the air park. There is I don't know, are you people familiar with it? I see somebody shaking their head, yeah. Airpark. You can buy a house and bring your airplane, and you know, you can park your plane right there, and they have a runway. So amazing, isn't it, huh? Anybody else have a story? Okay, this is where to find the book. Now this is what we're gonna sell here. It's in our clam system. It's in our library system. It's in the Nickerson archives at Cape Cod Community College. Sturgis Library has a copy. I know Dennis does. I know Centerville does. I don't know about any others, and the Barnstable Historical Society has a copy, and it's also available on Amazon in either ebook, softcover, or hardcover. When I published it, let me just talk about, can we go back to the beginning? Would that be?
The very beginning?
Yeah, just the picture of the okay.
Just go.
As a publisher, I know I wrote it, but I also published it. We kept, so I designed the cover, and that is a picture of the airport, 1929. We kept everything in sepia tone so that it would have that ambiance of old age, like us. And we even kept the type. The type is, because the log was written on a typewriter, it was in Courier at that point. So Courier type is the kind of type. So when we printed the book, or when we set the book up, we used the same type to keep it, you know, kind of pretty. Okay. What else do we have? Okay. Now I have a story to read. There's a young lady here, works here in the library, and she was kind enough. I called her yesterday to ask her how many people were coming, and she told me a story about her dad. And her dad was William Edward Wright. Kathy Wright, anybody know her? She's out front, yeah. This is the story, and she sent it to me last night, and it's a beautiful tribute. I'm getting choked up. Yeah. No.
Oh, no, you can't.
I have to be front and camera. Okay, she writes, Bill was born in the first house on Little Island in Osterville, which was designed and built by his parents. He was fascinated by airplanes and flying, and as a young man, he took flying lessons whenever he could scrape together enough money. I believe he may have had lessons with Russell Boardman. Remember him? Okay, but I am not sure. I remember it was one of the founders of, or early aviators at the Hyannis Airport. Could very well have been of Sherman too. Excuse me. After high school, he worked as a timekeeper for Danielle Brothers Construction in Wiano. Upon joining the Navy in January 1942, he became a land-based naval aircraft mechanic. He liked to say that he was a Navy man who had never been aboard a Navy vessel. He was stationed in Guadalcanal during the Bougainville and Munda, M-U-N-D-A, campaigns. Having found his calling in the Navy, Bill used the GI Bill to attend Cal Aerotech in Glendale, California, where he became a master aviation mechanic. In 1947, Bill retired to Cape Cod, where he worked as a civilian employee for 30 36 years at Otis Air Force, later ANG. He worked in the soap lab, the transit alert, and at the test cell. Although he worked with a number of different airplanes, the most notable was the veteran F-106 Delta Dart, part of the Cape Cod 102nd Fighter Interceptor Wing Base, whose mission was the defense of the eastern seaboard throughout the Cold War. Bill's job at the test cell was to assure the jet engine's performance after major service. As his many citations and awards confirm, he took the work deeply to heart, and there never was a crash or fatality related to any of the engines he tested. That in itself is a tribute. A lifelong problem solver, he could devise solutions to many household problems as well as design ways to improve the efficiency of jet engines. He brought his dedication and curiosity about science and nature to all he did. As a keen observer of animals, weather, astronomy, and all aspects of aviation and space travel, he enjoyed carpentry, reading, and traveling, especially if he was driving, as well as just plain tinkering. He was a gentleman and a gentle man with a wicked sense of dry humor. As a young man, Bill dreamed of becoming a pilot. Surely now he's got his wings. I thought that was just a beautiful tribute, and I thought it was a perfect way to end. And I want to thank you for being a wonderful audience. I know we bored the daylights out, but you're just the greatest. So thank you for letting us be here.